Welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video I'm going to get a bit more progress made on the terraced houses. This is a big long job that's been taking a couple of years, and I've finally got them to a point now where the whole row looks quite presentable. I'm also going to build this structure here. This is a shop with some office space above it, and it just helps fill in this awkward area that is at the edge of the baseboard that joins onto the existing office block that I built previously. I'll also be adding lighting, street lighting, and numerous small details to the streets in this area just to make things look a little bit more realistic. So I've just about come to the end of the next round of detail for these terraced houses. These are a scratch build that are loosely based on a real set of houses in Coldharbour Lane in Brixton, South London. And I think they look quite good. I'm quite happy with how things are going. It's got that sort of urban, sort of rundown feel, but they have taken an extraordinary amount of time. I've been working on these for sort of an hour at a time in the evenings after work over the past few weeks, and whilst they're certainly not finished, I've got them to a point now where all of the houses have got the bulk of the details fitted. So I've made sure with these houses just to add a few subtle differences to just sort of reflect a sort of bit of personality and some sort of history and changes with each individual property. So the first thing that probably stands out is they were all sort of weathered to a different finish. Some of the houses have whitewashed brickwork, whereas the others are still in their original London brick. There's two different styles of windows and there's two different styles of front door. As you can see, I've also added curtains to all of the windows. That took absolutely ages, and I've made sure to add different styles of curtain for the various windows throughout the properties, just making things look that little bit more interesting. Some of the roof detail has a little bit of lichen and moss and stuff like that growing on it, and you can see all of the chimneys are now installed. The properties at the moment all have the same style of chimney pot, as I'm trying to sort of portray that, you know, some original features of the buildings are still very much there, and then other bits have been changed. So a good example would be the windows. If we look at these two houses here, you can see the cleaner building on the right has PVC, possibly double glazed windows, and the brickwork is in more presentable condition. The building on the left looks considerably more run down and still has the old style wooden sash windows. With regards to the drain pipes and the guttering, I've also made a few subtle changes here and there. So there's two different thicknesses of drain pipe on the properties, just to reflect, say, changes and replacements and things like that. So at a glance, they all look broadly the same, but when you get a bit closer, you can see a little bit of personality and a few changes between each property. In future, I might add some other details to these, but for the most part, I'm well and truly done with them, and I'm just going to enjoy them for the point that I've got them to, and perhaps in a year's time or something we'll come back and we'll make some more additions and changes to these houses. As you can probably tell by the wires poking out the bottom of the buildings, there is lighting now installed, and I've also gone to the trouble of separating each window into its own separate room, so it's now not possible to look through the entire property out the back of it, and the sort of darkness that's now in there gives you the illusion that there are different rooms within the properties. And I've also made sure to only light a small selection of the windows, so at night time things look that little bit more realistic. From normal distance, I'm quite happy with how they look without an interior. The lighting should provide a nice ambience and sort of mood at night time, and the presence of curtains behind the windows I think is enough to sort of sell the illusion that the buildings are perhaps more furnished than they really are. While it's difficult to see on camera on the roof of the building, I've gone for a sort of felt finish for the roof sections using just ordinary white paper. And I've also painted each section of roof in a different colour. They all follow a similar theme of grey, but they are all weathered to different standards. Some of them have moss and some of them are different colours. Here's a closer look at the interiors, for want of a better word, of the buildings. As you can see, it's made from card, 2mm thick card, and once again I used my Cricut Maker machine to cut all of those out, and used a little bit of design so everything sort of slots together nicely and holds a nice strong structure. These slide up into each individual building, and as you can see I have added some LEDs to light individual rooms. So I'm going to take these upstairs, put them onto the layout, and we'll look at adding a few extra details and bits and pieces perhaps on the street scene to further improve the appearance of these buildings. Moving on from the terraced houses, I'm making a start on a small shop that's going to go next to the office block that's at the bottom of the street near the terraced houses. As you can see, I've made some decent progress already, cut out various bits using the Cricut Maker machine, and we can now start gluing those together and assembling the various parts. When designing the various buildings, I take a look at real places, usually using Google Street View, and just try and find a building that sort of roughly portrays what I'm looking for. And in this case, you can see we've got a Ladbrokes here in Slough. And whilst this building is not going to be an exact copy of that, it's going to take a few bits of inspiration, and I'm going to adapt the dimensions and stuff to better fit in with the small space I have available on the layout. Once I've decided roughly what I want to make, that then translates onto some paper, and I just basically go up into the attic and, using a steel rule, measure roughly what I want to do, what the footprint's going to be, how things are going to look, and then I'll come downstairs and draw that building roughly to scale, with various dimensions to just assist me when it comes to actually drawing it out on the computer. With that complete, I then draw everything out in the Cricut Maker design suite, which is just the free software that you need to use with these machines, and that eventually ends up with some physical parts cut out on the machine, ready to go. First step is to glue the brickwork to the card. I just use a bit of super glue to do that, as per the rest of my buildings. You can see I've left cutouts for windows and doors, and there's also cutouts for the windowsills as well. Just a nice little touch to the building, just gives it a bit of extra realism if you add windowsills and things like that. Being a shop, it's very unlikely that the front facade of the building will be solely brick. Usually it's got concrete, plastic and other stuff, so I've cut out a small piece of plastic there. We'll glue that over the brickwork, and that will become the actual shop part of the building. Now I'm just gluing in the first and second floor as well as the roof. By designing in some tabs on these sections, it just allows nice precise assembly of the building and keeps things nice and strong. For all my buildings I use a variety of glues. For plastic to plastic I use the Deluxe Materials plastic glue. For card, specifically the 2mm card, I use the Rocket Card glue, but that's also a nice general purpose sort of glue for doing most things. And then when I've got to glue plastic to card, I tend to use the Rapid Super Glue, and I find that's quite a nice combination. And so far my buildings are all standing, some of them being now 3 or 4 years old. So as you can see, I've glued the various bits of card into the building. I also cut out some squares here just to give it a bit of bracing, give it a bit of extra strength. The final installation will have it butted up against another building, so this other building will be somewhere around here. So we've got a nice flush wall there for it to butt up against too. Bit of sanding to do along the edges, both sides of the building, just to get that face nice and smooth, which I can do on an orbital sander or just a regular sanding block and a bit of 80 grit. Inside you can see the floors that make up the building and how those slot into the faces of the building, and it just makes things nice and strong. Up top I've cut some plasticard and just run some more bricks around the roof just there, and I've also added some coping stones, capping stones, whatever you want to call them, and those are just made using some scale model scenery roof tiles which I've cut down. They come on a sheet a bit like this. I just glue a strip on the edge of the roof just there. Once it's dried you can just flip the building over and run along that with a sharp knife. The building next to this one has got a felt roof, so for this one we'll probably go for a sort of cinders or gravel sort of finish, something like that, just to add a bit of variation. So I'll keep going with the building. Relatively simple structure, so it doesn't take too long to put it together. And the next thing to do is to start adding the windowsills and a few other bits and pieces. At some point I will give it a good coat of primer and start painting the building, but as it's a relatively simple basic structure, it's relatively easy to paint in an assembled state. So I'll just get as much of it put together as I can and then paint it afterwards. As you can see, the building is starting to take shape now. I've done a bit of painting and a bit of mortar washing, which I've shown numerous times on the channel. But just to briefly summarise for this building, I sprayed it with an aerosol can to prime it, make sure I got a good coat of primer over everything, and then sprayed on some Rail Match dark brick and then went over the top of that after it had dried with my sort of homebrew mortar wash, which is just a mix of various Vallejo colours. Using some cotton buds and a bit of thinner, I rubbed off the excess on that, and that has created the brickwork finish that you can see on the building just there. Obviously it's a little bit clean and pristine at the moment, but obviously that will be weathered in due course. The window sills are just made from some pieces of card glued onto the face of the building in the slots that I designed into the brickwork, so quite pleased with those, and I've just gone over those with some white paint and a brush. You can see it's not a perfect finish, and that's just what I'm going for. The building looks a little bit more authentic that way. If everything's absolutely squeaky clean and to the mill, it can all look a little bit too perfect. Windows for this building are coming from Scale Model Scenery today. I've had these particular ones in the collection for a couple of years, and I thought I might as well find an excuse to use them up. And as you can see, these are the modern hotel windows or office windows, which are 20 by 17 millimeters. I've just sprayed those white and then glued a little bit of evergreen clear plastic to the back of them, and they should look quite nice, just placed into the front of the building just there. You can also see that I've taken some 80 grit sandpaper with a sanding block just to the edges of the building, just to tidy up the shape here and make sure that this structure butts up against to the neighbouring building without too much of an obvious gap. I'll put some sort of roof access down here, and then I think we'll go over that with some very fine ballast for the roof effect on this particular building. As I say, just to keep things looking a little bit more interesting, as the neighbouring structure to the left has got a felt roof. So as you can see, I've made quite a bit of progress on the building since the last clip. We've got all of the windows installed, and I've also applied the blinds to the back of those windows. The blinds are made by Scale Model Scenery as well. I've used lots of those on the layout, and they're very effective because you can actually see through the individual slats in the blinds, which looks quite effective with building lighting. Up top, I've applied some Woodland Scenics fine ballast just to give a bit of roof detail, and I've also placed a small roof hatch here, which is a Scale Model Scenery drain cover, and instead of the sort of patinated metal cover in place, I've just put a square piece of card just to make it look like a small sort of roof access hatch for doing maintenance and whatever up on the top of the building. Above the windows, I've added some additional brick detail in a similar style to the building I'm using for inspiration. We'll touch a little bit more on that in a second. And down at the bottom of the building, you can see I've painted the shop facade, added a pair of doors, and also put a period correct shop logo in place. John Menzies was quite widespread in the UK during the 1980s and the 1990s. Long gone now, of course, but my research has turned up that there was one of these in Swindon, which is roughly in the sort of area of the country that the layout is based. The brick detail above the windows is made by Redutex, and this stuff is a flexible sheet with an adhesive backing on it. So basically you just cut it and stick it to whatever you're making. I was looking for bricks in this style. I think this is called stack bond, but I might be mistaken. Basically where the bricks are stacked on top of each other. You quite often see that for supporting bits above windows on buildings, and sometimes it's just done for making the building look a little bit more attractive. You can see by adding it across the top of the windows just there, it just adds a little bit of extra interest to the front of the building and makes it look a little bit more interesting. Doesn't look quite so bland, and just adds an extra thing to look at on the front of the building itself. Whilst I'm trying to build a dull structure, I still want some level of personality and interest in it. This company makes loads of different textured sheets in different scales and different styles, and it's the first time I've used it. I'm quite impressed with it. I think it's quite good. It turned up on the market a couple of months ago, I think it was. I saw Rails of Sheffield has started stocking it, and I was a little bit sceptical at first, but certainly worth a try. A couple of sheets I'm sure would be quite useful for different projects. Whilst all of the sheets do come pre-coloured and pre-weathered, I'm not overly keen on the German World War II armoured vehicle colour scheme they've got going on here. It's not really lending itself all too well to the building I'm trying to make. However, it is quite easy to paint. You can see on the bottom of the sheet I've airbrushed it in Railmatch light brick, and then I went over that with my usual mortar washing technique, cut off the strips and then applied those to the building. I've also added some drain pipes and a bit of guttering in a few places. This stuff is made by Scale Model Scenery. There's lots of different companies that make gutters and drain pipes, and I use pretty much all of it, to be honest. It's nice to have variation on the different buildings throughout the layout. I've used quite a lot of Wills and Ratio stuff in the past, and as I've not used that much of the Scale Model Scenery drains, I thought I'd put those on this building just to, again, create that effect that, you know, these buildings were all built at different times with different materials and equipment over the years. And inside, I've just applied some paper tile sheets just to give the illusion of some carpet tiles or some sort of a floor inside the building. Once again, this is a Scale Model Scenery item. Taking shape, but there's still plenty to do, so I'll keep working on it, and eventually we'll get to a stage where it can be placed onto the layout and fill in that last little section next to the existing office building. I've made a bit more progress with the shop, and I've also added some much needed street lighting to this section of the layout. There's a little bit more in terms of lighting to add in future, but already just the presence of some street lamps along this road is making it look quite a bit more realistic. I've placed the shop back into position, and as you can see, it just fills that very awkward little section at the end of the baseboard just next to that existing office block. As you can see, I've been quite deliberate in making this building appear different to the one it's attached to, just to give that sense of the sort of history of the town and how certain buildings are going to be more youthful than others and of different designs and what have you, much like you'd see in a real high street. So hopefully you can get the impression there that the John Menzies is perhaps an older building. It's got a little bit more weathering on it, as you can see, and it's also got more generous ceilings. The building to the left, with the insurance company in it, is very much more of a 60s build. I've also done a bit of work around the surrounding area, just making sure that the pavement is up to scratch and fits against the new building. I've added a few slabs and done a little bit of repainting here and there, and I've also just generally tidied things up and made a few corrections and improvements. Something else I've done is add a section of brick plasticard to the inside of the bridge just there behind the retaining wall, and as you can see it just disappears into darkness and just finishes that area off quite nicely. Previously that was just a bare piece of plywood, and from certain angles, especially when looking across the scrapyard, it was very noticeable, and I really needed to get that area tied back together. All of the lighting is now wired up for the terraced houses underneath, and once again I've just made sure to tidy up the pavement and make a few improvements and touch-ups here and there, as I've worked quite heavily on this area, and of course things do get damaged from time to time. Still plenty of detail that can be added. I'm very tempted to add some TV aerials and maybe one or two satellite dishes, as that technology was just starting to creep in during the 80s. I've previously shied away from it with things like tower blocks and stuff, but the people who live in these houses might have had a little bit more money to play with, so let's take that and see if we can add one or two more bits and pieces of detail. Behind these two buildings, over on the canal section of the layout, you can see how the John Menzies sort of ties in to the scenery in this area, and it's nice now just to have scenery running all the way to the end of the baseboard. I've added a few details as well as a access door to the base of the building, and just generally kept it looking quite bland and uninteresting, as is fairly typical for a building of this style. I will be adding some graffiti in a similar manner to the building next to it. Nothing too much, but it will certainly break up the building at the rear and perhaps make it look a little bit more exciting. I'll also be making some slight changes and adjustments to the guttering and perhaps some of the utilities on the back of the building. As you can see, I did add one drain pipe, but it's right next to another existing drain pipe, and whilst I have found examples of that in real life in a few places, I might change things around. It's quite easy to do as it's only glued on with some rocket card glue, but now it's in situ and it's next to the building it's going to be at home with, I'll make a few changes and just sort of generally improve things as I go. You can see, of course, as well, I need to tie the scenery into the fascia board on the front of the baseboards and just get rid of that sort of quite white looking plywood. Once I've bedded all the scenery in right to the very edge, I'll be going over that with some black paint just to tie it all in, and it should look a bit better. I've left this wall of the building open for the time being, as you can actually see inside the building just there, out through those front windows, and you can look across the street and you can see the trains going past. How well that's going to work on camera, I'm not sure, so I'll leave the building open for the time being and see how I get on with it. But in the future, it's very much a possibility that I might just blank this off, perhaps with a panel that's removable, so I can do a quick shot with the camera looking inside, but we'll see how we go. As you can see, I've added some interior detail to the shop on the ground floor, and that is very much a case of just a couple of random pictures from Google Images of resale, and I've just glued those to some bits of card and painted them in the appropriate colours, and it just helps sell the illusion of an interior on the building. It's difficult to see fully inside, and I think that does a reasonably enough job. I'll be doing something similar for the office space above. Lighting is very much my usual style with buildings like this over multiple floors. We've got two pieces of brass rod there, and they run right the way up to the top of the building, and you can see where I've got the wires soldered onto those bits of brass rod for the LEDs that are in the ceiling. I've done my best to keep the wires hidden from view, glued them to the ceiling, and then just run them in the corner down through those bits of brass rod. That then comes out through the bottom of the baseboard and just connects to two regular wires and runs off to the nearest junction block where the 12-volt supply is for the layout lighting. Underneath the baseboard you can see I've kept it very simple. Red for positive, black for negative. There's a 12-volt supply coming along the side of the baseboard just there. And then we get to this section and you can see there's quite a lot of various connections for the various buildings and street lamps and stuff. Up there is a street light, and the rest of the wiring is all associated with the various buildings. I've used a couple of Pico wiring clips just to try and tidy things up a little bit, but as you can see, very much a simple, no nonsense affair, and it's just easy for troubleshooting and nice and simple to wire up. This area is starting to look very urban and quite busy. I'm really pleased with how it's looking. There's a lot of detail left to add, and of course there's numerous figures that are missing from the pavements, but that's something I'll do very much towards the end, as they're very fragile and easily damaged. Of course, there's very much the elephant in the room, as in what's going to happen with this section here. It will be another building, and what I've got planned I won't reveal just yet, but I've been thinking about it for a long time, and hopefully over the next couple of months I'll get something built and placed into this section of the layout, and that should really help finish things off and give that very sort of dense urban appearance of a typical British town. Here we are with the lights on, and as you can see we're starting to get enough light pollution now from the individual buildings and street lamps to just sort of light up some of the general areas of the layout, such as walls and road surfaces, and it's making things a lot easier in terms of filming, and the camera is actually starting to pick things up now, how they actually appear to the naked eye. Since the previous video I have adjusted the colour temperature of the LEDs in this building, and I've just given them a very slight yellow hue just to make them a little bit more authentic for the time period. And I think that works quite well, especially with other buildings in the distance. You can see the big block of flats, which is about 2 metres away from where we're sitting, and you've also got the signal box a little bit further up the line on the left of that block of flats, all having their own slight different hues with regards to colour temperature. And it's the same story for the terraced houses. You can see there's different intensities and colour temperatures going on there. At the moment I think the whole lot is very slightly too bright, and that's easily adjusted with a resistor, so I'll make sure I do that in the future. But with the addition of the street lighting I'm really pleased with how this looks, and the buildings are casting nice shadows across the parked cars outside and out onto the road. And it's also nice to get this area lit, as there are various other areas of the layout that are lit too, and this area now extends quite nicely. If we work our way around the corner into the area with the retaining walls with the various shops, and then you can see the station with the various buildings down there as well. There you can get a better look at the new building with the slight bit of interior detail on the ground floor just there. I think if I add a few more bits to the upper floors it will look a lot better, and you can see it's just got 2 LEDs per floor, just giving a nice spread of light. And once again I've adjusted the colour temperature of those just using that Tamiya clear orange paint. The number of coats over the LED dictates how orange it ends up being, and that works quite nicely just to keep things nice and varied. To the rear of the building you can see it's a
a much darker, dingier affair. I think a solitary light in the scrapyard would really help, and perhaps a little bit of lighting for the towpath that runs underneath the bridge next to the canal boat would just help add a little bit of gentle lighting to this area and make things look a bit more interesting. You can see the signal box in the distance just there. The chap stood in the centre looking out over the tracks, and of course next door we've got that block of flats that appeared in the previous video. And once again, very pleased with the lighting on that, just the sort of thing I was looking for.
For now, I shall continue to add various details to the scene, and I think we'll start things off with some aerials, TV aerials. These ones are made from plastic, and I bought them from eBay. They come on a little sprue, and so far I found them to be quite durable. Being obviously injection molded plastic, they do stand up to a little bit of abuse. In the past I've used aerials from Scale Model Scenery, which I believe are printed on laser board and very much more fragile. Whilst they look very good, they're very easily damaged, and the few that I did place on the layout certainly didn't last long. I'm sure there's people out there that 3D print these as well, but for the same argument, very fragile, I don't think they'd last long. So I'm quite happy with these ones being made of plastic, and there's just enough detail to sell the illusion of what it's supposed to be, but robust enough to withstand the odd knock here and there. And with regards to satellite dishes, I've got these Bachmann Scenecraft ones, again made from plastic, so they should withstand the odd knock here and there. These are of course the more modern style of satellite dish that you would have seen in the 2000s, but the technology was starting to make an appearance, albeit rarely, during the late 80s, and whilst the dishes were a different colour and they were a little bit more bulky, it's a small bit of detail at the end of the day, and if it's not available, then it's not available. So I'll put a couple of these around the place, and 99% of people will just take them for what they are. Okay, so that's another round of details applied. Tiny stuff, very difficult to film, but hopefully you got the gist of it. You can see the various aerials attached to the roof of the terraced houses. Little trick with aerials, make sure they all point in the same direction, because they'd all be receiving their signal from the same transmitter. I've added a couple of benches in a few places, as well as a small number of satellite dishes, which I've painted grey rather than the sort of glossy black they were finished in. I've also added some dustbins, various different styles available. I've used quite a few on the layout. These ones are Bachmann Scenecraft, as they've got a nice moulding of the lid, and yeah, they look quite good actually. I'm quite pleased with those. I've placed a few of these along the length of the street. While it's not collection day, plenty of people don't take them in, so it would be normal to see a few of them lurking along the street. I put in some pedestrian railings over on this side just to stop people from crossing the road in that slightly dangerous spot, and it's the sort of thing that you quite often see around various towns. A few street names here and there. I've placed these up relatively high in the sort of position you tend to find them in the London area. Quite pleased with these benches. They're made by Scale Model Scenery, a little bit fiddly to put together, but certainly looks the part, and I've placed those at the end of the terraced houses and along the side of the canal. I've also added some mooring rings to the edge of the canal, very tiny, but does just add that little bit of extra detail, and actually surprisingly noticeable even from a distance such as this shot. So all in all, quite a lot of work and quite a lot of little details and bits and pieces to add, but I think it's really lifted this area and it's added a lot of extra realism that it didn't have before. There's of course pieces that I can still add. You'll note that there's no road signs yet. That's another job for a later date, but I'm quite pleased with the progress so far. Similar to the terraced houses, an area like this is pretty much never ending and you can just continuously add bits and pieces to it. But there does come a point where you just have to say stop and move on to something else. So I've got a few more bits to do, but I think the more pressing matter is this big spot of bare plastic, which currently has nothing on it at all. So I'll switch my focus for the next video concerning this area with regards to more buildings and structures, and then we can do another round of detailing with all those various small parts, such as what I've done at the end of this video. So I hope you enjoyed that. Jumped around a little bit with various different bits and pieces, starting off with those terraced houses, moving on to the shop, and then finally general detailing on the area. But hopefully you got the gist of it, and I'm really pleased with the progress I've managed to make in this spot. The next video will most likely concern doing a bit more scenery and just making a few changes and upgrades to the scrapyard. There's a number of products that have come onto the market since I initially built this area, and I think it'd be nice to add some of those to this scene. And whilst it does look good and I'm very happy with it as it is, as I said previously, an area such as this, there's always excuse for more detail and it's pretty much never ending. So in the next video, I think we'll turn our attention to the scrapyard, and I'd also like to do a little bit of lighting over on this area of the layout. Nothing too crazy. I mean, a scrapyard's not really going to be lit up at night, but for the purposes of setting the sort of mood and making things a bit easier to film when I've got the lights off up here, I think 1 or 2 lights over on the scrapyard could cast some really cool shadows and just create a really moody looking scene that transitions nicely into the lit buildings that we have over on the street section. So I hope you enjoyed it. As ever, I will be back as soon as I can once I've made enough progress on the next section.